Why did early Dungeons and Dragons punish elves and dwarves for being, well, elves and dwarves? They couldn't take certain classes, they couldn't reach the same levels as humans, and seemed doomed to fall behind their human companions. But it wasn't bad design. It was the secret to how the game balanced its entire world. Let's talk about class and race restrictions and demi-human level limits today on Daddy Roll the One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. It's also going to be part of my sub-series that I'm calling Rules Worth Remembering, but these are forgotten or little-known rules like using henchmen and hirelings, or having a mapper or caller in your party, tracking resources, and those kinds of things that can actually make your game better, or at least help explain why rules were written the way that they were. So today we're going to be talking about restrictions that were placed between which race could operate as which class, and then how far those races could advance in the classes that they chose. So for this video, I'm going to be talking about the TSR editions of Dungeons & Dragons, beginning with the 1974 edition of the original game, and then going all the way up through the 1989 release of second edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which continued on until the company was acquired by Wizards of the Coast in 1997, and then actually for a few years after until third edition came out in 2000. So if I have time, I may very briefly just talk about how the concept changed in the modern editions. But what we're talking about here are these restrictions that are placed between class and race, and then again, level limits. And for people who are new to the game, coming in with third, fourth, or fifth edition, this is probably all brand new to you, and you didn't even understand that this was a thing. And we're going to talk about why it became a thing. We're going to figure out the sort of the genesis of where this idea came from and why it was implemented into the game, and then talk about edition by edition how it was dealt with, because it's dealt with differently in different versions of D&D, even though they were all published under TSR. They addressed the topic differently. And so learning about that kind of history of the game and these little nuances and figuring out rules that you might want to take a second look at maybe and bring back into a game or implement even in a modern game. If that kind of stuff is of interest to you, then I'd like to ask you to please take a few seconds to like the video, double check to make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and make sure that you adjust the settings on that bell icon so that you'll be notified when I upload new videos. So let's just frame the topic and talk about what these limits were. What is it that we're talking about here? Again, to make sure that people who are new to studying this understand and have the context and the framework. So in early versions of Dungeons & Dragons, going all the way back to the original game published in 1974, there were restrictions placed on which race could operate as which class. So you couldn't have a dwarf wizard. Neither dwarves nor elves could be clerics, as an example. Dwarves and halflings in the original version here could only be fighters. So I'm going to get into this more as we get into it. And on top of that, even when they could be a class, they were limited to the level that they could advance to. There was a level cap past which they couldn't keep progressing. So they could keep adventuring, but earning experience points at that point was pointless because they couldn't keep going up in level. Okay, so your elf fighter in original Dungeons & Dragons might peak at level 4. And then which is the hero stage or hero level title. And that might be adventuring with the human fighter who is going up to 7th, 8th, 9th level and beyond. And so I think that there's probably some confusion here with modern players who, again, where this concept is new. And quite frankly, it might even have confused people back in the day when it came out. But it feels arbitrary. It feels like, why would an elf who is so long-lived, much longer lived than a human, learn, say, more slowly, which is kind of what it's implied, right? It's sort of baked into this idea. If they can only get to a certain level, they aren't learning as quickly as a human is. And, I think you have to remember then it's really not arbitrary. It might not have been as an elegant game design mechanic as it could have been, but it was done for a reason, and it wasn't designed for short-term fairness. Okay, these ideas were designed for long-term campaign balance. And that's a nuance that I think a lot of people don't really see when they see these level limits. But we're going to get into why that existed and what I mean by that when I say it's not designed for short-term fairness. Okay, so And to understand why these level limits existed in the first place and these class and race restrictions existed, we need to rewind not just to 1974, but we're going to go back before Dungeons and Dragons was published and look at some of the inspirational stuff that came beforehand. Okay. So again, in order to establish that this wasn't really arbitrary, we have to understand that throughout the evolution of the concept, the creators of the game are trying to codify this idea of human primacy, especially Gary Gygax. And again, I'm going to have some quotes from here that's going to talk about that. But if we go back to, like, say, Blackmoor. So we have Blackmoor Foundation's book here, which is the early fantasy RPG works of Dan Morrison. I'm just showing these examples. And then I've showed this many times on the channel before. This one is First Fantasy Campaign, which is First Fantasy Campaign meets Blackmoor. That was Dave Arneson's tongue-in-cheek way of saying that, because they didn't want to put Blackmoor on the cover, because by the time this was published by Judges Guild, the Blackmoor quote-unquote trademark at that point was owned by TSR after Dave Arneson had left the company. So now Arneson is not a role-playing game with the mechanics. It is a role-playing game. Let me put it that way. It is role-playing. But what I mean is it doesn't have mechanics that are developed in the same way as say Dungeons and Dragons, and it confuses a lot of people when they try to figure out, like, what classes did Blackmoor have. Blackmoor didn't have classes. They had roles or archetypes. Characters played things, but they weren't codified and defined, because Dave Arneson wasn't really a codifying and defining kind of guy. He was more of a very much in the vein of, like, you tell me what you want to do. I'll put a scenario in front of you. This is what's going on. You tell me how you want to interact with that scenario, what this challenge is. You tell me how you want to overcome that challenge, and then I'll tell you what happens. Okay, so they do over time start to have, we've seen character sheets from Blackmoor before where there's like ability scores and ranks, and they can so they can compare and contrast. This character's better looking than this one, or this one's stronger than this other one, etc. Right? But the concept of, like, a fully defined character class with, like, experience point levels on a chart that you could look at to see how you were leveling up, that didn't really exist. However, you do have, like I said, these roles being played. And one of the things that we do have in Blackmoor pre-Dungeons and Dragons is players playing non-human characters. You had Ross Maker, who I got a chance to meet at DaveCon a couple of years ago in April of 2024. He played the very first dwarf ever in a role-playing game, which was in Blackmoor. Okay, and he was at that convention, which was really cool. And there was also a guy named Martin, and I just forgot his last name. It's like Noetzel or something. I'll put it up here on screen. He played a character or an archetype. He played a role in the Blackmoor game of the Wandering Elf. Okay, and we also know that there were halflings. So let's look at this book over here. So this was a gift to me last year for Christmas from one of my viewers who it was on sale from Amazon for like half off, and he sent it to me, which was really, really nice. I really appreciated that he sent this over. So this is the making of original Dungeons and Dragons in 1970 to 1977. Okay, so in here, there's just a bunch of, like, all these old notes here. There's a lot of reprints of stuff like Chainmail and the original D&D. Like, if you don't have the box set from original D&D in the white box, and they're so expensive to get now, you could pick up this book and it reprints all of those original books and the first 3 supplements and Chainmail. Okay, but one of the things it has a lot of are these notes going back to, like, Arneson's Blackmoor campaign. And the book's very heavy, but so it says here, this is from 1972, very clear. It says this is from Corner of the Table from May 1972, Blackmoor Gazette and Rumor Monger. And this is written by Dave Arneson about his campaign. And he says, it was reliably reported that Mello the hero hobbit was waylaid by a street gang while he and the Invisible Wonder were investigating a robbery on the south side. So there were hobbits in Blackmoor. Now, my understanding, though, is that Dave Arneson hated hobbits, or at least strongly did not like hobbits, but they are in this book. Well, they're in Blackmoor, and we see that, and that's before Blackmoor is introduced to Gary Gygax when Dave Arneson and Dave McGarry drive to the Twin Cities to show Gary the game. Okay, now, in Chainmail and the Fantasy Supplement, here, we have... Well, you can see on this table here, we have halflings and sprites, dwarves, gnomes, goblins, and kobolds, and then elves, fairies, and orcs. So you've got the classic 3 core non-human races of D&D, dwarves, elves, and halflings. And they're in here. And when you look at their abilities, halflings, these little chaps have a small place in the war game, but you may want them for recreation of certain battles. Remember that they are able to blend into the background and so make excellent scouts. They can fire a stone as far as an archer shoots, and because of their well-known accuracy, for every 2 halflings firing, count 3 on the missile fire table. So they're getting bonuses with ranged attacks with slings or rocks, and they're being able to hide and make excellent scouts. It says blend into the background. Okay, and then you have dwarves, and it says because of their natural habitat is deep under the ground, these stout folks operate equally well day or night, which implies that they can see at night, i.e. infravision, or dark vision if you use that term in a later edition. Okay, it says also, although they are no threat to the larger creatures, trolls, ogres, and giants find them hard to catch because of their small size and count only 1/2 normal kills when dwarves and gnomes fight with them. For either attacks upon dwarves and gnomes or returns should the dwarves be the attacker. Okay, so they're talking here about giant-sized creatures trying to hit gnomes and dwarves specifically. We're talking about dwarves today, and not being able to hit them as easily because the dwarves are so small. Okay, and then for elves, armed with deadly bows and magical swords, elves and fairies are dangerous opponents considering their size and build. They can perform split move and fire, even though they're footmen. When invisible elves and fairies cannot attack or be attacked, unless located by the enemy with a special ability to detect hidden or invisible troops, but they can become visible and attack during the same turn. Those elves and fairies armed with magical weapons add an extra die in normal combat, and against other fantastic creatures, they will perform even better. So they get bonuses to hit against goblins and orcs and things like that. So we're seeing the classic, like I said, the classic 3 here in Chainmail, and these are kind of the precursors of the way that they're going to be described in original D&D. As far as like their mechanical abilities, we're starting to see some of that come out here in the fantasy supplement in Chainmail. Okay, so one of the things that we're going to see as well is I want to point out this letter that Gary Gygax wrote to Dave Arneson. So I'm going to go back to this book, The Making of Original Dungeons and Dragons, which again just has so much good content if you're someone who likes to study this kind of stuff. I'm going to flip over to this note here that we're going to see written from Gary Gygax to Dave Arneson. And he's going to say, this is 1973, a year before Dungeons & Dragons is going to be published. So what's happened is that Dave, for context, Dave Arneson and Dave McGarry, again, have gone to Lake Geneva and shown Blackmoor, and also the game that's going to eventually become known as Dungeon with the exclamation point, the board game. That was Dave McGarry's design. They've shown them to Gary Gygax and like his companions, his players in Lake Geneva. Okay. And so he says, but then Gary gets sick. I think it got the mumps or something. And he says, being sickly and not up too much, I drew up a couple levels of the local Blackmoor, and he says, i.e. Greyhawk. So he's referring to Greyhawk as a Blackmoor because Blackmoor wasn't just a setting, it was the style of game that they played. They called it a Blackmoor style game. And Blackmoor style of game, of course, is based on the Brownstein style of games. We've talked all about that here on the channel before. Okay, the chaps were so nuts about the game that most of my spare time has flown into levels and rules for an eventual campaign similar to yours. We have 11 players at the moment. Taking your stuff a bit further, a player can begin at any class, warrior, magician, or cleric. Each has advantages and drawbacks. There are 9 classes of fighters, 11 of magic users, and 7 of clerics. Now, when he says classes in that case, he means levels. They hadn't decided on terminology yet. And then it says dwarves who can spot moving walls and such, and elves who more easily locate secret passages and doors can only progress to 6th and 4th level class warriors, respectively. So dwarves 6, elves 4. And then it says 5th and 9th class, it's hard to read because it's typed out. 5th and 9th class magic users, both respectively, and cannot become clerics. So in this note, Gary's telling Dave, like, I'm writing this up, I'm codifying this, which is not something Dave Arneson really liked to do. Dave Arneson had other strong suits. Gary very much wanted to write everything down. But he specifically says, elves and dwarves and elves can advance as fighters to 6th level dwarves, 4th level elves. And then he says, and as magic users, dwarves can be 5th level, go up to 5th level as magic user, and elves can go up to 9th level as magic users, but neither one of them can be clerics. He doesn't say why. He just says they can't. Okay. So there's really no justification for the limits of elves and dwarves as far as like their level limits. And there's also no justification or rationale for why they can't be clerics. But I thought that was fascinating because that was something I had never known, that for, pre-D&D, Gary was thinking of having dwarf magic users. However, what we're going to see in here in this book, which this was a huge thing because I'd never seen this before. This is the first draft of D&D from 1973, trying to fit it in the camera here. And so you see these typewritten pages here. And so this predates the version that we saw. Now, I have seen a different version of like a pre-version of Dungeons and Dragons. This was still, for me, amazing to see this early version of the game typed out here, this 1973 draft. Okay, so one of the things we're going to see, however, in here is he says dwarves. Dwarves may only be fighting men. As a fighter, they can progress at 10% above normal, and the dice cost for strength and cunning and intelligence will modify this accordingly. Thus, a dwarf will normally progress 10% faster and has the advantages regardless of minuses or pluses. Dwarves, however, may not go above the level of Myrmidon. So Myrmidon is the level title for a 6th level fighter. So he's keeping it at 6, like he put in that note that we just saw. But he's saying that they can only be fighting men. Whereas, in that note that he wrote to Dave, he said they could also be magic users, but that's out the window now. He's limiting it to just fighting men. And then elves, he says, in the magic user class, elves may progress as further than the warlock level, may progress no further than the warlock level. In the fighting men class, elves may not progress beyond hero. Hero's 4th level. I forget what level warlock is, but it's probably 9th or whatever. That sounds about right, because I think wizard is 11th level title, so warlock is probably 9th. Okay, so we're seeing, however, these early restrictions starting to be placed even before the game is published. Gary is making choices to restrict class and race and also level limits for non-human characters. So he's tightening these boundaries, but interestingly enough, we don't see hobbits in that note that he wrote to Dave Arneson. So there's no mention in here of hobbits in this note. And in this 1973 draft, it's also not mentioned. So you just saw that only 2 races that we see in here are elves and dwarves. There's no halfling or hobbit, as they would have called them back then. Okay, and because then it gets right into character class. Okay, so and then it mentions again elves and dwarves. Okay, so again, I found that very, very interesting to kind of see that even before original Dungeons & Dragons is being completely printed and written, from that note that Gary wrote to Dave, Gary was wrestling with this, what in his mind was a balance problem, not between players, but between like within the campaign world itself. He wants humans to be the center of gravity. He doesn't say that, but it seems implied given that he's putting limits on which classes each race can operate in, and then what the level limits are, how far they can progress. So one of the things that we keep talking about is this trying to figure out Gary Gygax's rationale and reasoning behind this idea of humans being the center of gravity in the world, and his vision of a human-centric world, and where is this idea coming from? Why is he doing it? And so I wanted to look at this article. Now, this article is actually going to be written by Rob Kuntz, who was Gary Gygax's co-DM for the Greyhawk campaign. But this is from Dragon Magazine, issue number 13. But it's reprinted here in this Best of Dragon volume. And if you're someone who's looking to get into old Dungeons and Dragons and kind of investigate some of the old articles that were in Dragon Magazine, I think your best bang for the buck, you can find them all online. But if you want like a physical copy, you'll be better off getting something like the Best of Dragon, as far as like money wise. And it's got tons of like the best stuff in it, of course. So this is an article from the Sorcerer's Scroll, which is eventually going to become Gary Gygax's like copyrighted column. But this one's written by Rob Kuntz, and it's called Tolkien and Dungeons and Dragons. And the premise of this is that writers have been, fans have been writing into the magazine and saying like, oh, you guys handled dwarves and elves wrong because in Tolkien, elves are like way better than humans. And so you need to give them better abilities because the elves that you described like aren't as good as the Tolkien elves. And of course, D&D is not written to emulate Tolkien. And that's sort of the premise of this article. However, it's going to get into the game design philosophy of the non-human races. Okay, so he says, people have complaints about it, and many of the complaints are that it doesn't emulate Tolkien, and it says it wasn't intended to. And so he quotes a letter from a fan, and he says, one might say I'm nitpicking to pick on this person, whatever, but we hope that those people will respect the way that we play, for we think the designers know best. Okay, so here's the very specific part. The game was designed stressing the human aspect of play, humans being ultimately the strongest and predominant race on any Earth. With a few exceptions, most worlds of fantasy and swords and sorcery writers are predominantly inhabited by humans. Elves, dwarves, and hobbits were the minority races on Middle-earth and were never in the spotlight for long time periods. Furthermore, D&D was not written to recreate or in any collective way simulate Professor Tolkien's world or beings. A few were included, such as Balrogs, orcs, etc., for it was recognized that Tolkien had made some impressions upon the fantasy literary world which were worth including in D&D, but not to the extent of basing the game system around them. That is left up to separate judges. But then he says, if you do that and you base your world on Tolkien, then you're really not playing D&D. You're playing like a variant, because D&D wasn't designed to, again, simulate or emulate Tolkien. Okay, so he says, players must remember also that elves, dwarves, and similar creatures were around before Tolkien took to the field, and determinations of advancement, etc., are left to the separate authors or judges as the case may arise. Tolkien's elves have been on average better than human of his world, but in D&D, it can be quite the opposite. On the other side of the coin, though, elves and dwarves are limited to the level they may obtain. Though elves and dwarves are limited to the level they may attain, they gain early advantages, noticing secret doors, sloping passages, etc., which partially makes up for their lower levels later on. And then he says, one must also remember that this system works with the worlds of R.E. Howard, Robert E. Howard, Fritz Leiber, and L.S. DeCamp and Fletcher Pratt much better than that of Tolkien. If one's to branch away from D&D's system, let's say to Tolkien's world, he will be disappointed to find that most spells, characters, etc. do not function well within the world of Tolkien. So this is sort of, to me, like the Rosetta Stone for understanding the class and race limits in D&D. D&D wasn't about simulating Tolkien's world. It's about creating a human-dominated fantasy world inspired by broader, more sword and sorcery style fiction. I know people discuss this all the time, and people say you can't say Gary wasn't influenced by Tolkien. Of course he was influenced by Tolkien, but other influences as well, and those influences are more predominant, and you can see it in the way that he does the writing. Again, this article is by Rob Kuntz, but they shared a similar philosophy on this, that the worlds of D&D primarily are going to be human-dominated worlds. So it says D&D wasn't written to emulate or create any specific world, and it's not, but it kind of is, because it's Gary's vision of what he thought a fantasy world should be, and in that fantasy world, humans are the rulers, and the other races, the demi-humans, work with humans, but they're sort of like sidekicks almost. They're not like the main characters of the story. Okay, and we're going to see that theme as we go through, and it's going to be explained better in other editions of the game. And so I think, again, the primary idea to understand here, though, is that you had a game mechanic reason for figuring this out. One is that you've got non-human characters having abilities that humans don't have. And so you need to compensate somehow. And so part of the compensation is going to be, well, that means humans get a bonus by being able to be any class they want and advancing to any level that they want. And then the balancing factor for the demi-humans is that they have to pick and choose between a limited number of classes, and they have limits on their levels. Okay. And then you have your in-world reason, which is that Gary wanted humans to be dominant. And so he's writing rules to reflect that, but he is giving bonuses to the demi-humans. And so then you're having to, like, I don't want to say retcon, but you're kind of having to create lore to explain a game mechanic and vice versa. And in this case, they're very, very closely tied together. The lore reason is that Gary wants a human-dominated world. That's how he wanted to create the game. And then the game mechanic reason is that, well, he's going to do that by putting limitations on the demi-humans so that humans can eventually advance past them into higher levels of greatness and experience. Okay, so let's now go to 1974 and the release of original D&D and start defining these limits, because this is going to set the stage for what we're going to see throughout every edition of D&D published by TSR. So this is Men and Magic Volume 1. And as we get into the different types of characters you can play, we've got preparation for the campaign and characters. Okay, and we see again our three classes: fighting men, magic users, and clerics. And it's going to tell us that fighting men, it says all magical weaponry usable by fighters, etc. Okay, now a couple things we want to look at here. Top level fighters, lords and above, who build castles are considered barons. And as such, they may invest in their holdings in order to increase their income. See investments under section of volume 3. Base income for a baron is how much, but basically you get to build a stronghold and then run it, or build a castle, it says. Okay, magic users. It says top level magic users are probably the most powerful characters in the game, but they begin very weak. They have all these items that they can use. Wizards and above, so wizards is an 11th level magic user, may manufacture for their own use or for sale such items as potions, scrolls, and just about anything else magical. Costs are commensurate with the value of the item, as is the amount of game time required to enchant it. Okay, then we're going to get to clerics. So I'm pointing this out, and then we're going to get to our races. Clerics have gain some of the advantages from both of the other two classes, fighting men and magic users. Okay. When clerics reach the top level patriarch, that's level 8 for a cleric, they may opt to build their own stronghold, and when doing so, receive help from above. Thus, if they spend 100,000 gold pieces, they may build a fortress of double that cost. And then finally, faithful men will come to such a castle, being fanatically loyal and will serve at no cost. Okay, so one of the end games of Dungeons and Dragons that a lot of people don't talk about, especially in the TSR editions, but really the early TSR editions, as we get into like second edition, this ceases to be as important. But in the earlier versions of the game, there was kind of this end game idea that your character was going to rise to this level of 9th level, which at the time that was like exceedingly rare. Okay, but you got to the 9th level, and then you built a stronghold. All these people come to live there and fight for you and all this kind of stuff. And you are now in charge of your own little domain. And at that point, you are probably going to retire your character, because you're no longer adventuring at that point. You want to manage your domain. You don't want anybody taking it over and having, a coup or something, or a rebellion or whatnot. So you're going to stay and maintain your dominion and defend it against monsters and all this kind of stuff, right? So you're really probably not going on too many more adventures. Okay, now let's read what it says for Dwarves. Dwarves may opt only for the fighting class, so it's going to keep that restriction that we saw in that 1973 draft. And they can never progress beyond the 6th level, Myrmidon. So that stays the same. So dwarves are going to stay the same. So what does that mean? That means a dwarf is never going to build a stronghold or have a barony, because they're not going to reach name level of lord. Okay, but then it gives you all these abilities. Their advantages are 1, they have a high level of magic resistance, and they thus add 4 levels when rolling saving throws. A 6th level dwarf equals a 10th level human. So they save much better than the average person. They're the only characters able to fully employ the +3 magic warhammer explained in volume 3. They note slanting passages, traps, shifting walls, and new construction and underground settings. They're able to speak the languages of gnomes, kobolds, and goblins in addition to the usual tongues. Okay, so that's it for dwarves, but those are some pretty big benefits. The biggest one being that they have saving throws that are much better than everybody else. Okay, so one of the sort of the lore reasons then that people have used to explain why dwarves can't be magic users is because their increased saving throws means they're more resistant to magic, and because of that, they can't therefore learn magic, because their physiology as a dwarf means that they are more they are less susceptible to the abilities of magic, but that also means it's very difficult for them to learn, because their natural like I said, physiology wants to push that magic away and not be around it. Okay, so that's dwarves. Now let's look at elves. Elves can begin as either fighting men or magic users and freely switch class whenever they choose. We've talked all about this before and the vagueness of this wording. So that's not really what we're talking about here today, but they can be magic users and fighters, and they flip-flop back and forth depending on what the player wants to do for that particular adventure. It says, that they may use magic armor and still act as magic users. However, they may not progress beyond 4th level, which is the Fighting Man. And so in Fighting Man, which is 4th level is hero. And again, we saw that in that note that he wrote to Dave Arneson and in the 1973 draft. And he says, nor 8th level magic user, which is Warlock. Okay, so I was wrong. I said Warlock was level 9, so it's not. It's level 8. So apologies for that mistake earlier. And he says, elves are more able to note secret or hidden doors. They also gain the advantages noticed in chainmail rules when fighting certain fantastic creatures. So we talked about that before. They get all those bonuses when fighting certain creatures, orcs and goblins and things like that. Even undead. I think there were some undead on there, which they got advantages too. And then it says, finally, elves are able to speak the languages of orcs, hobgoblins, and gnolls in addition to their own elvish and the other usual tongues. So very specifically, again, you have benefits that elves get that other classes don't get. Elves can operate as fighting men and magic users, and they can wear magic armor and cast spells. That is a huge thing that nobody else can do. It makes elves stand apart, and it defines them based on these abilities. Okay, so that's one of the things that you're seeing from this is that these races, these non-human races, are being defined based on the abilities that they have, and it's sort of defining their culture, what they can do. They're fighter magic users. They see secret doors. It's just an innate ability. They can find them easier, that kind of thing, and they speak all these different languages. All right, now halflings. Now, I think that this might be slightly related to Dave Arneson's dislike of halflings, but perhaps Gary Gygax also disliked them. But we've seen, where players in the Blackmoor campaign specifically said Dave Arneson did not like halflings or hobbits. They call them hobbits. So it says, should any player wish to be one, I'm back in Men and Magic here, under the halfling entry. Should any player wish to be one, he will be limited to the fighting men class as a halfling. Halflings cannot progress beyond 4th level or hero. So that's the same as an elf, right? But they will have magic resistance equal to dwarves, which is very much better. It's 4 levels higher. And they will have deadly accuracy with missiles as detailed in Chainmail. So bonuses to attacking with, this says missiles. So this would be any missile weapon. Could be bow or sling or anything like that. Chainmail was a little bit more specific. I think it was like thrown rocks or whatever. Those are some of the restrictions that we're seeing. And again, it's right here at the very, very beginning. So you have elves being sort of, what we would call a multi-class, essentially, or dual class fighter magic user. You have dwarves being fighters only, and you have hobbits being essentially a weaker fighter than even a dwarf. But then you have clerics being human only. So there's nothing in here about elf and dwarf and halfling clerics. So the idea here is that demi-humans are sort of like exceptional. They have these abilities, but they're not the norm. They're not setting the baseline. Humans are the baseline. Okay, and then on top of that baseline, you add all these extra goodies for elves, dwarves, and halflings, respectively. And then to balance that, they're restricted by which class they can operate in and then how far they can advance in those classes. Okay, so it's not just about numbers. It was partially the design choice, but it's also about the tone of the game. Demi-humans are rare and powerful early on, but they're not meant to eventually eclipse humanity's role in shaping the world. These are worlds that are living, breathing, and dying sort of based on the decisions made by powerful humans as they advance. That's how Gary Gygax saw that. So you might not see your world that way, and that's totally fine. You can change your world, of course. But that doesn't mean that it was wrong to make these decisions. This is how Gary envisioned the world's being based on his exposure to the inspirational source fiction that we've talked about before. So in this particular case, level limits are really a campaign balance tool. Again, we talked about this. It's not an instant fairness tool. An elf at first level is way better than a human at first level, because elves, again, can choose between being a magic user or being a fighter on each particular adventure. A human can't do that. A human has to pick a class and stick with it, okay? A dwarf is better than a human at first level because a dwarf fighter saves as though he were a 5th level fighter instead of a 1st level fighter, because he's going to add 4 levels higher, right? So that's huge. Those saving throw rolls are going to be huge, okay? And then same with halflings, having those saving throw bonuses. And then halflings getting better attacks with their missile fire. So they're all getting things that humans don't get. So the at first level it's balanced. It's really not balanced at first level. It's balanced for campaign play. Okay. Now humans are going to shine, however, in long-term play, because we saw those name levels. Magic users are creating magic items. Elves can't do that because elves are never going to reach that level where they can create magic items. Dwarves and halflings are never going to reach the level where they can run a barony. Okay, that doesn't happen. Humans do that. Humans are leaving a legacy of these things that they've created, these castles, these strongholds, these powerful magic items, potions and scrolls and all kinds of things that the magic users are creating that are going to be left behind after the shorter lifespan of the human has expired and the humans are no longer with us. You're going to have dwarves and elves left with these masterful creations from humans that the dwarves and elves are never going to achieve because that's not what they do. That's just not something they strive for. It's not a goal for them to do those kinds of things. They're doing other things. They're longer lived. They see the world differently than humans do. Humans have this desire because they are around creatures that live longer than them. Humans know they're going to die first. And so the humans are going to strive to achieve as much as they can, as quickly as they can, and leave something behind so that they're not forgotten. Whereas the elf and dwarf doesn't see the world that way, especially the elves being so long-lived. So most campaigns now, however, are going to retire when the human hits that name level, most likely, and starts building all these things to leave behind. And then they're going to start new characters and start over. So although like an elf can only go up to 8th level as a magic user, a human at 11th level is probably going to retire that level because the goal is to get to the point where you can create magic items. So you might still do that on the side, right? But you're not adventuring anymore and you're going to start a new character. So it's really only 3 levels of difference before everyone's probably going to start over again. That's how a lot of people played it back then. So the level limits are more about world texture than being like a penalty. It's more about, are there powerful elves and dwarves running around your world willy-nilly? And no, because the humans are the ones that are doing that. Okay, so hopefully you get that point of view. But that's original D&D. Now let's just see what happens when we get into some of the supplements here. So supplement 1, I've talked about this being, probably the most important book in the history of Dungeons and Dragons. Now, what's going to happen in this book? A couple of things. We're going to see the introduction of the thief class. We've talked all about that before, so I'm not going to get into that. Other than one of the interesting things that it's going to say is that they are not as strong as other classes in hit dice, but they have distinct advantages. Okay, so they can employ magic daggers and swords, but none of the other magical weaponry. They can wear only leather armor and cannot employ shields. And they can't learn spells, but they can, at higher levels, read spells written on scrolls. And then they have basic abilities, and we all know the thief abilities, so I'm not going to read them. But then this is the key point. Furthermore, dwarves, elves, half-elves, or hobbits may be thieves, and in this class, there will be no limit to their continuing to advance to the highest levels. So that's interesting. So this is the first time we're going to see non-human races being allowed to operate in a class to unlimited levels. Okay, and it's only with the thief class. Okay, so that's an interesting sort of pragmatic shift. So Gary's starting to be a little bit flexible because I imagine most likely he had players who were playing these demi-humans who were complaining that they had to stop adventuring once they hit 4th, 6th, or 8th level, depending on which race and class combination you were playing. Okay, so I think that's really, really interesting that he makes this change. Now, why just the thief? The thief class works in this context, and this is a very difficult argument to make. But essentially, the thief works because it's a skill-based class. It's a skill-based class. So it's not reliant on any innate magical ability. Like you could make an argument in your world that the reason that elves can become magic users and humans can become magic users is because there's something in them physiologically. They have an innate ability to learn to wield these powers that dwarves and halflings and other races don't have. So you could make that argument. And I think that that's a fair world building argument to make, that it's not just about getting a book and having proper materials and studying. There's only certain types of people that have the ability to become magic users, and certain races don't have that ability to do that because they just don't. Okay, that's just part of the world building. Okay, so you could say that, right? But a thief, you can just study and get better. You can practice lock picking and you can practice these things. Now the difficulty becomes with fighting. Couldn't you continue fighting and just get better? And so that's where the argument, I think, falls down a little bit, but there are, like, dwarves are archetypal fighters, right? That's what you typically think of when you think of a dwarf in say like Norse culture and things like that. you kind of think more on the fighting end than you do, I think, or like token dwarves, especially more on the fighting end. And so it's kind of emulating a certain archetype by having them just be fighters. Okay. But also, I think the thing that a lot of people don't think about, and we're going to get to this in just a second here, is that the adventuring, the non-humans that are in a D&D game are the adventuring non-humans. They're probably a little bit different, cut from a different cloth than the rest of the people from their species, okay, or their race. All right, but in mechanical terms, the thief then becomes the loophole. This is Gary's loophole, and it's his way of keeping demi-humans playable deep into a campaign without having to break the world logic. So also, interestingly enough, of all the 4 classes, and I don't think anybody would argue with this, of all the 4 core classes in original D&D, and including Thief as the 4th core class introduced in Greyhawk, Thief is by far the weakest. They have D4 hit die. Once you get to Greyhawk and everybody has variable hit die instead of everyone having D6, they have D4 hit die. They don't have any magic. They can read scrolls, but not till like 10th level, maybe 9th or whatever it is. And they have these abilities, open locks and pick pockets and climb walls and stuff, but their abilities are terrible at low levels. And even at mid levels, they're maybe only half effective. A wizard spell works every time. You know the spell, you cast a spell. Once you cast it, it's gone. The benefit of the thief is that the thief abilities are replenishable. You can use it over and over again. But the magic user spell is not going to fail because there's no roll involved. Once you have the spell, you cast it and it works. A thief has to take a chance that it might not work. Your ability might not work. So you could be climbing and you might fall. Okay. Or you could try to open the lock and you can't open it. And then what are you going to do? So those are limits to the thief. So, and the thief can only wear leather armor. They don't have a lot of armor that protection, and they can use any weapon. That's a benefit. Okay. But that's a small thing because they're not great fighters. You're not going to put them in frontline combat, or you shouldn't, because they've only got D4 hit points. Okay. So thieves are kind of like the weakest class. So by letting that one be the one that demi-humans can advance to, that's that game mechanic balance that you're then trying to justify with an in-world lore reason as to why it's the case. But the game balance mechanic is by having high-level demi-human thieves, that's not going to unbalance anything, and no one's going to be upset about it, that the demi-humans or the non-humans got all these different abilities at first level because they're just thieves. So that's kind of like part of that game balance, okay? Now, one of the other things that's going to happen in here, let's go back to the section on dwarves. So it's talking about dwarves can work simultaneously as fighters and thieves, which is cool. So the first true multi-classing, you can be a fighter thief as a dwarf. Okay. And it says, but no bonuses for abilities above normal are then given. So you don't get any of your bonuses if you decide to multi-class for having high ability scores. Okay. And it says that always earned experience point is always divided evenly between fighting and thievery, even when the dwarf can no longer progress in the fighter class. That means that once you pass 6th level as a dwarf fighter, which is the Myrmidon level, and then go to 7th level, you can't go to 7th level, but you can keep progressing as a thief. But when you earn 1,000 experience points on an adventure, you're still dumping 500 of those into your fighter that's no longer progressing. So you're going to progress now much more slowly as a thief if you choose to multi-class as a fighter thief. Okay, so I think that's an interesting, again, it's a game balance mechanic to keep demi-human multi-class, which is a thing that only demi-humans can do as multi-class. Humans cannot in this version of the game. So you would think that every demi-human would do that. Well, if you do that, you just know that at a certain point, well, you're going to progress much more slowly anyway, because you're always splitting your experience points. And you are operating in both classes starting out. It's not multi-classing like in 3rd edition or 5th edition, where you start as one class and then people go like, oh, I'm going to dip into this class for a few levels to get these abilities. And once I hit that ability at 3rd, then I'm going to add this one, and I'm going to be a paladin, sorcerer, warlock, or, pallock, or whatever they call them, right? Like, that's not how this was. When you started out, if you decided to be a dwarf fighter thief, at first level, you were both a fighter and a thief, and you got the abilities of both. And then you just split your experience points, and there's different experience points tables. So you're going to advance as a thief much more quickly than as a fighter, because a fighter needed 2,000 experience points to get to level 2. A thief only needed 1,200. Okay, so you're always going to be a little bit higher level thief than you are fighter, but at first level, you're going to have the abilities of both. Okay, so that's dwarves. Now, another thing it's going to say here is that among the dwarves themselves, but never as a player, there are clerical types. Dwarf clerics are found as high as 7th level, Llama, and they can cure and resurrect their own. These clerics are also fighters. So it's basically telling you among dwarven society that you're not going to see as an adventurer dwarf, because the adventuring dwarf can only be a fighter and a thief. But among dwarven society itself, there are fighter clerics. Okay? And that implies something, right, about world building, because that's implying that the dwarves that don't go adventuring have different abilities. Okay, they're different. Or the other way to look at it is those are the standard dwarves, and the adventuring dwarves are, like I said, different. They're cut from a different cloth. They're taking chances. They're gaining different kinds of skills at the expense of other types of skills. So PC dwarves cannot be clerics, but among the dwarves themselves, there are clerics. So to me, that implies that there's probably some type of dwarven kingdom or something that is sort of isolated, and it's set apart, and it's not interacting with the rest of the world. They kind of keep to themselves. They're probably fighting monsters and stuff in their mines or in mountains or whatever it is. But, humans aren't probably humans aren't traveling there and interacting with them all the time, right? The dwarves are going to keep to themselves. And then there's adventuring dwarves that leave dwarven society. Those are the ones that maybe they don't quite fit in and they decide to go out into the wider world and start adventuring. So you can start to try to figure out reasons to why these restrictions exist and make them world building reasons, which I really like. Okay, now elves, same thing. It says that elves now have a different thing here, where elves of 17 or 18 strength can work up as high as 5th level, so they're no longer limited to 4th level fighters if their strength is 17 or 18. If their strength is 17, then it could go as high as 5th level, and then 16 if it's an 18. Okay, and then elves with an 18 intelligence can work up as high as 9th level sorcerer magic users. They're still not going to hit that name level. They're not going to hit that ability to make magic items, but they can go one higher level. This is where ability scores start to be important. You get ability score creep. Before this, people weren't really all that uptight about what their ability scores were, because your ability scores didn't do a whole heck of a lot. We've talked about that many times here on the channel before. So see my video on ability scores if you want to understand that. So it says, among the elves, there are clerical types as high as 6th level bishop who interact only with their own kind. These clerics, and then it says fighter, magic user, cleric types have magical ability limited to the 6th level magician. So it's telling you that among the elves themselves, there are multi-class fighter, magic user, clerics. So they have 3 classes, but in so doing, they're limiting themselves to where their magic user can only go as high as 6th level. Okay, because they're splitting their experience points across 3 different classes. But again, it's starting to define elements of elf society that the average human in this world probably is never going to interact with. Okay, just like with the dwarves. Okay, and then it says elven thieves work in all 3 categories at once. So if you want to be an elf thief, you're going to be a fighter, magic user, thief, unless they opt to never be anything other than in the thief category. So what this is saying is that they can't be fighter thieves or magic user thieves. If they want to multi-class as a thief, they have to be a fighter, magic user, thief, and split their experience points across all 3 classes, which means it's going to take forever to level up. Okay, but that's what they're going to do. And then it says, again, you're going to be splitting your experience points even when you're no longer able to progress in a couple of your classes. Okay, so it says, however, it is possible to be an elven Myrmidon, 6th level, sorcerer, 9th level, master thief, for example, with a character having exceptionally high scores in strength and intelligence, and the only limit on how high the thief category the elf can progress that will be placed upon him by the division of experience points. When acting in the thief capacity, the elf can wear only leather armor. As dwarves, elves have infravision, okay, blah, blah, blah. All right, and then it says hobbits can be either fighters or thieves, and as thieves, they have a better chance for doing most things. So now halflings are going to be able to advance to unlimited level as a thief. Okay, and then it says for half-elves, they're able to progress simultaneously as both fighter and magic user classes. Okay, and then it says they can also be, and we've talked about this before, some very poor wording here. They can also be clerics, it eventually says. And they can, if they decide to be clerics, they have to divide experience in equal proportions between fighting, magic use, and clericism. So they have to be fighter, magic user, clerics. They can't just be straight up clerics. Okay, and then it doesn't talk about them multi-classing as thieves, which is interesting. So that's one where they could be a thief because it says they can advance to another level, but it doesn't tell you that you can multi-class as a thief. Okay, but we're starting to see these changes are helping to give demi-human players a little bit of a bump. They're demi-human characters of players, giving them a little bit of a bump, and I think it's really interesting. So again, with these concepts of like clerics being only as NPCs, and what does that mean for your world and your world building? So we're going to get 2 other supplements for original Dungeons and Dragons that are going to debut new classes. So that's Blackmoor, also 1975, and Eldritch Wizardry, 1976. So Blackmoor is going to debut the Assassin and the Monk, and Eldritch Wizardry is going to debut the Druid as a player character. Druids actually appear in Greyhawk as a monster, but in Eldritch Wizardry, it's going to be detailed as a character class. So all 3 of those, however, are going to say that humans only. So even though like Assassin is a subclass of Thief, and any race can be a thief, this is going to say only humans can be assassins. Okay. And then same with monks and druids. All right. So that's, Gary Gygax and et al. TSR sort of doubling down on this idea that humans are the primary, race in this world, because they just debuted 3 new character classes that are only playable by humans. Okay. So let's continue and just talk about some other classes that are going to debut early on. These aren't by Gary Gygax. They're not technically official. They're not by Dave Arneson. They're going to appear here in Strategic Review. And again, I'm looking at my copy of Best of Dragon because I don't have those early issues of Strategic Review. But we're going to see the debut of the Bard class here by Doug Schwagman. Now, this is the version of the class that Gary is going to base the Bard in Player's Handbook on. I've talked about that here on the channel before. I have a whole video on Bards if you want to learn more. But one of the things that it's going to say in here about the Bard is who can play a bard. And it says a bard has a thieving ability, blah, blah, blah. And it says elves, dwarves, and halflings may be bards, but cannot progress beyond the 8th level minstrel. Now, that's something that Gary's going to change. So this was written at a point where I guess, it's either written in Strategic Review before Greyhawk Supplement 1 has come out with the half-elf in there, or it's just ignoring that. But he's going to say that elves, dwarves, and halflings can be bards, and Gary's going to change that in the Player's Handbook and say only humans and half-elves can be bards. Okay, so that's a different change. But this is opening it up to the idea that other races can be these classes. Now, let's continue and look at what other things debut on here. Well, we have the original Ranger class. This is going to be by Joe Fisher. We've talked about that before a little bit here on the channel. It says an exciting new Dungeons & Dragons class, and it says Rangers are a subclass of fighting men similar in many ways to the new subclass Paladins, for they must always remain lawful or lose all their benefits they gained, except, of course, experience as a fighter. Strength is their prime requisite, but they must also have intelligence and wisdom scores of at least 12 each and a constitution of at least 15. And then it gives you the stats for the Rangers. Again, it talks about spell use and all this kind of stuff until they attain 8th level. Characters in the Ranger class are relatively weak, for they have a number of restrictions. You'll notice nowhere in here did it say what race was available. Well, we just talked about this in my video on the Paladin class, edition by edition. But as you saw, when the Paladin class debuts in Greyhawk Supplement 1 here in that video, it talks about this idea that it basically says fighting men, if they've been lawful since the start of their career, and they have a charisma of 17 or higher, can opt for the paladin status for the paladin class. Okay, so technically that means that anyone who could be a quote unquote fighting man or fighter, any race who could be that, could then qualify to be a paladin if their charisma was 17 or higher and they were lawful, which means dwarves, elves, and hobbits, who can all be fighting men as long as they were lawful from character creation and had a charisma of 17 plus, could have been paladins. Okay, it never says that they can't. Okay, so a lot of people miss that because they're so used to the idea that in first edition AD&D, paladins were human only, but in original D&D, that restriction's not there. It was probably intended to be there, but it's not stated outright. So there were players back then who qualified, and there was a very famous story or at least it was mentioned that there was a dwarf paladin due to that vague language, because I think it wasn't intended that non-humans could be paladins. So to my reading then, the way that this is described for the Ranger class here, and it says it's similar to paladins and it's a subclass of fighter. When I see subclass of fighter, I start to kind of think, Well, then if you can qualify as a fighter, or like play a fighter, which every race can, and you meet these qualifications, which are just ability scores. You have to have, a constitution of 15 and a wisdom and intelligence score of at least 12. Okay. If you have all that, then you should be able to qualify. Oh, and you have to be lawful, right? As a ranger as well, because remember, this is a 3-point alignment system. There's no good or evil. It's just lawful, neutral, and chaos. So if you could make those qualifications as a fighting man or a fighter, that you could qualify as a ranger, which to me means that dwarves, elves, and halflings could qualify to be rangers as presented in strategic review. Whether that was the intent or not, I don't know. But since it doesn't say that you can't, I always sort of feel like then you should be able to. Okay, unless it specifically says that you can't. Now, the last one that's going to be in here is going to be the illusionist. Well, that does. Okay, first off, it talks about witchcraft. It's a witchcraft supplement. It goes all through these rules for witches. However, in that particular case, it never says that they can be another race. It doesn't say that they can't. But it's not really a subclass. It's like its own thing. It's mostly rules for like new spells and things like that. So that one's a little bit kind of open to interpretation, I guess you could say. The debut of the illusionist. Okay, so it says generally appearing as a new class for Dungeons & Dragons. Now it says illusionists are a subclass of magic users. So this is going to be another one where this is by Peter Aronson, and it's not going to say whether or not they have to be human or not. It doesn't specify. Now, again, if we're using my sort of proxy of if it's a subclass and you qualify for the main class, then you should be able to qualify for the subclass if you meet all the ability score requirements. Then in theory, I guess you could make the argument that elves could qualify to be illusionists if they make that qualification. Now, you could easily, just as a dungeon master, of course, always say no, right? But it doesn't specify. And that's why as we go on through these editions of the game, Gary's going to get more and more specific about codifying these rules because they create questions. When you don't address something, it creates a lot of uncertainty and confusion in folks. Okay, so here's the illusionist class. And again, I think that in theory, you could argue that since elves and half elves can qualify to be magic users, they could also qualify to be illusionists. Okay, so those are the classes that are going to be debuting in here. This is Best of Dragon Volume 1, but originally in the strategic review. Now, there's more classes even in Best of Dragon Volume 2. So this is where things are starting to get a little bit more specific. And I think, it's just fun to look at some of these, plus just to see what the classes are. I did a whole video on all these classes before, so you can see that if you want to get more details on how these classes work. But the Anti-Paladin debuts in here. Now, this is written in July 1980, which is 2 years after original Dungeons, or first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons have been published. And in 1E, first edition advanced, paladins can only be human. So this never says what the racial requirements are. But I think it would be implied that since this is the chaotic evil version, the mirror version of a lawful good paladin, then the anti-paladin is probably also human only. It doesn't say that, but I think the implication is there. So that's the Anti-Paladin, a fan favorite for years. Gary hated them, but there they are. Now, the Samurai. This is another one. It doesn't actually say. You might think culturally that doesn't make sense to have non-human samurai, but it never says in here that they have to be human. And it does say that they are a subclass of fighting man. And so in that case, again, if you can meet the requirements to be a samurai, so you have to have a dexterity of greater than 15. Okay, so having that and being this subclass fighter, if you can qualify as a fighter as your main class, then you should be able to qualify to be a samurai. So again, that's one interpretation. Okay, now you have healers over here. Now this is an interesting one because it basically says healers, as the name implies, are designed to allow rapid repair of other characters in large campaigns. Basically, the healer is a combination of magic user and cleric with a dash of fighter. So it's a very interesting. It's not the kind of healer that you're probably thinking. I mean, they do have healing spells and stuff like that. However, so combination fighter, magic user, cleric, mostly magic user, cleric. Okay, and then it's going to go on here to talk about who can be healers. Healers can be of the human, dwarf, halfling, half-elf, or elf races. So we know this debuts after Greyhawk Supplement 1. We see it's 1976. So this is pre-Dungeons, or I keep doing that. It's pre-first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. It's post-Greyhawk. And so it's going to include the half-elf. But basically every playable race that's available as of Greyhawk says it can be a healer, which again is interesting because it's allowing then halflings and dwarves to cast magical spells and cleric spells that original D&D prohibits them from. So whoever created this class, which is C. Hedelstad, decided to open it up to every race. Okay, so again, this is where you start to get fans creating things. I suspect that in this person's game, they might not have implemented the restrictions on race and class as we see them in original Dungeons and Dragons. So they may have opened it up. And so to them, it was natural then to just allow this class to be any race, but they put it in here and says like, yeah, any race can be this class. So probably reflecting how they played the game. And again, that's why Dragon was always repeating that this stuff was unofficial. It's not for player characters. It hasn't been play tested, all this kind of stuff, because fans are going to create stuff that they want to see, not necessarily what was intended with the original spirit of the game. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's why Dragon always is harping on that. Okay. So that's healers. Now we're going to get to scribes. Scribes is not going to say, it doesn't say one way or the other what race you should be. Now, you're going to get the debut of the Ninja by Sheldon Pierce. And it talks about them being like a subclass of assassin. Okay. And then it says non-human and female ninja exist, though they are rare. Elves, dwarves, halflings, and humans may become ninja. Now, when's this written? This is July 1978. So apparently, as a half-elf, you can't be a ninja. Now, we don't know when this article was necessarily written. We know it was published in 1978. But at this point, Greyhawk had been out for 3 years, so half-elves are in there. I would assume that Sheldon Price had seen it and just ignored it. But who knows? But in any event, this is opening up this very specific culturally Japanese ninja-type character and saying, yeah, dwarves, elves, halflings, sure, have them be ninja, which I thought was really, really interesting. You would have thought it would have been human only. Now we're going to get to the next class in here. I did skip past it. It is the Berserker, 1976. And this is by John Pickens. Now, you're going to see some differences here because John Pickens actually worked for TSR, created a lot of stuff. I've talked about Mr. Pickens before, and he has come into the comments from time to time to mention things, which, again, I think is great because it was this article. So I'm just going to, this was in Best of Dragon Volume 1, but there was this article called D&D Option Demon Generation, and also by John Pickens. And this captured my imagination as a kid. I loved, of course, the accompanying illustration, but I love this idea of designing your own demons using these like random tables. And so I've always had kind of high regard for Mr. Pickens and his design capabilities. But he wrote this article on the Berserker, and he's going to state straight out, second sentence, they are always human and always true neutral. So he's not going to leave it open to interpretation. He's going to tell you berserkers have to be human. Okay. And that's what you get when you have someone who knows that question is going to come up. This is the designer at TSR. I don't know if he was employed by TSR at the time that he wrote this, but he is eventually going to be employed there. But you have someone with a game design sort of hat on who understands how these things work together and understands that question is going to come up. And so he's just going to address it right in the article and not leave it open to interpretation. Okay. So those are some of the early classes that we see both that debut in the supplements, but also some fan created stuff in these articles in Strategic Review and Dragon Magazine. Wanted to point out a quick way that you can support the channel and get great custom content that you're not going to find anywhere else. And that's by becoming a patron of my channel. You can go to patreon.com/daddyrolled1, sign up to become a torchbearer. And for just $5 a month, you'll get custom content. I usually release stuff like every week. And so far, I have released 2 custom adventures, exclusive artwork and maps that you're not going to find anywhere else. So this was the Bone Mill. This was the very first adventure that I released. And then the second one, and I don't have a printout of this. This was an early draft. It was called the Scolomonts. It's the Black School. It's from a Romanian legend and Spanish legend about a magic school. And so I took that idea and ran with it. It's got tons of random tables and adventure hooks. It's got, again, a custom map that my designer worked to create. So these aren't maps you're going to find anywhere else online. And I've also done tons of like random tables. I've done weird fighter traits, weird cleric traits. I did a little small mini kind of supplement on doing horror in like say OSE, old school Central style or OSR style games. I've done one like a 13-page adaptation of that Mask of the Red Death box set for Ravenloft that I talked about back in October. I did a 13-page conversion of those rules from second edition Advanced D&D to old school Essentials, classes, kits, magic system, firearms, and all that stuff is things that my patrons get. And if you sign up today, you'll get access to all the previously released stuff that I've put out and then continuing every month from there on. So again, if you can check out patreon.com/daddyroll1, I would really appreciate it. And thanks so much for your support. Okay, now I'm going to talk about what I call the basic D&D line. And basically, all I mean by that is the non-advanced Dungeons & Dragons line. So this is the concurrent edition of Dungeons & Dragons that was published that was not advanced during the TSR era. If you have no idea what I'm talking about and that's confusing to you, check out my video on the history of D&D editions. It's very short. It's like 21, 22 minutes, and it goes through various different editions of Dungeons & Dragons from 1974 through roughly 2020. I include sort of like what I call half steps. So I talked about like a 5.5 edition in there that's prior to the 2024 edition. But this is Holmes Basic from 1977, intended to be a restatement of the 1974 rules to make it easier for new players to learn how to play. But then it was retconned and edited by the editors at TSR. It might have been Gary Gygax himself, who's going to change this to try to make it seem like it's an introduction to advanced D&D. So it's kind of its own thing. But it's basically going to cull down the list of classes. It's going to remove the paladin from Greyhawk. It's going to remove assassins, monks, and druids. It's going to keep the thief. It's going to remove the half-elf. And it's going to tell us in here that fighting men are any human character can be fighting men, and all halflings and dwarves are members of the fighter class. And then with magic users, it's going to say they're humans, but then it's going to talk a little bit about elves. Clerics are humans, and it doesn't say anything else. And then it says thieves are humans with special abilities. Okay, and it says there are special rules for halflings, dwarves, and elves who wish to be thieves. These are given in advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So in Holmes Basic D&D, without referring to advanced Dungeons and Dragons, you can't play an elf, dwarf, or halfling thief. So your dwarf is going to, and your halfling are going to be fighting men or fighters, and your elf is going to be that classic sort of combination of fighter magic user. And then humans can, of course, be any of the four classes. So that's essentially it for Holmes. I'm not going to delve into this too much. It caps at 3rd level. So there's really no difference if you, like for the level caps, it's not really addressed in here because it's only going to 3rd level. Now, 1981, this is the Moldvay Cook Marsh or BX version of Dungeons and Dragons. So what's going to happen in here essentially is we're going to debut this idea that's called race as class. And what I mean by that is it says character classes. Most D&D characters will be human. A human may be a cleric, fighter, magic user, thief. And it says humans are the most widespread of all the races. The human traits of curiosity, courage, and resourcefulness have helped them to adapt, survive, and prosper everywhere they have gone. So this is giving you world-building reasons of why humans are more prevalent in the world. Some players may wish to have demi-human characters, elves, dwarves, or halflings. Each type of demi-human is a class in itself. The demi-human races are cousin species to humans. Each character class is further explained hereafter. So you can see in the list of classes, you see dwarves and elves. They're listed as classes. So I've talked all about this before. I have a deep dive video where I get into this, and there'll be a link up here in the upper right hand corner to check that video out because I think it's a nice companion piece to this video. But essentially what this means is that they're going to combine race and class for any non-human character. So you're playing an elf, and the elf has the ability of fighters and magic users. They can wear armor, cast spells, and use any weapon, right? So it's going back to the original roots. It's just stripping out this idea of like, oh, you're playing an elf, but your elf is really fighter magic. It's just saying you're playing an elf, and this is what your elf can do. Your dwarf is essentially a dwarf fighter, but you're playing a dwarf. You're not playing a dwarf fighter in this version of the game. Now, that's just semantics because mechanically it works out the same way, but it's trying to streamline. This is a basic version of the game. You see, it says basic rules. It's trying to make it easier for people to learn how to play, especially if they've never played before, don't have a wargaming background. And so it's it's using very specific and easy to understand language. You are playing a dwarf or an elf or a halfling. Okay, so that design is going to stick all the way through, like the BECMI edition of D&D that comes out in 1983, and then, the Rules Cyclopedia, the Easy to Master, or the Black Box version, and then the classic D&D version is going to keep this concept as race as class, and that is one of the distinguishing factors of this line of D&D, this basic line, versus advanced D&D, like we are going to talk about here in just a second. So, I think that the race as class actually solves the idea of balance, this balance problem, pretty elegantly, because it bakes in the archetype of the race into the rules. So it's simple and it's flavorful, and I really like it. All right. Now we are to first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, 1978 is when the player's handbook comes out. And this is where this system is really going to become codified. Okay. Again, this is Gary Gygax writing the majority of this. So we're going to see an expansion to this race and class restriction tables. We're going to see very specific level limits detailed. We're going to see multi-classing formalized, very detailed again. And, through a lot of articles and interviews and things like this, Gary's basically going to talk about this idea that humans are adaptable, ambitious, and dominant. We kind of started to see that even in the Mulvey BX book I just put out, although that came out post this. That came out in 1981. But demi-humans are specialized, and it's kind of implied that because they're so long-lived that they are slow learners because they don't have to rush. So it's not like they aren't capable. It's just like their culture, or whatever you want to say, it's like doesn't reward learning things quickly. It rewards learning them well and taking longer and really figuring out all the ins and outs and the nuances. Again, that's something that you can role play if you want, but the implication is they are going to take longer to learn these kinds of things. And it keeps the world consistent, again, with the fiction that Gary Gygax continues to claim that he was inspired by, that more sword and sorcery style stuff, that, like the Barsoomian, the Mars stuff, Edgar Rice Burroughs, of course, Conan, Robert E. Howard, Fritz Leiber, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, like that kind of stuff tended to be more Gary's bread and butter, okay, as opposed to like more modern type fantasy. So again, it's not punishment, it's preservation of tone. So let's look at what we have here. And we're going to see, so there's this table here which shows the character class limitations, and it's going to tell us which race can operate as which class. So we see a longer list of classes now: cleric, subclass druid, fighter with subclasses of paladin and rangers, magic users with subclasses of illusionists, thief with subclasses of assassins, and then monk. But we're going to see that dwarves can operate as fighters, assassins, and thieves. Elves can operate as fighters, magic users, thieves, and assassins. Gnomes can be fighters, illusionists, thieves, and assassins. Half-elves can be clerics, druids, fighters, rangers, magic users, thieves, and assassins. So they have the most options of any of the non-human races. Halflings can be fighters and thieves. Half-orcs can be clerics, fighters, thieves, and assassins. And humans can be everything. Okay, so that's that table. Now, on the next table, it's going to tell us our level limits. All right, so anything you see in a parenthesis means that's only available for non-player characters. So we see we're returning to this idea of dwarves and elves having non-human clerics, but so do gnomes. Halflings do not, but the halflings have non-human druids, NPC druids that can advance to level 6. Cleric NPC gnomes can advance to level 7. Elven NPC clerics can go to level 7, and NPC dwarven clerics can go to level 8. Okay. And then you see half-elves can go unlimited as druids, but only level 5 as clerics. Half-orcs can only go to level 4 as clerics, and of course they can't be druids. Humans are unlimited in everything. Okay, and then you see here again, fighters, dwarves 9, elves 7, gnomes 6, half-elves 8, halflings 6, half-orc 10. So it's expanding these a little bit, and now we're going to start to muddy the waters a little bit because a fighter name level is level 9, and now we're seeing that dwarves and half-orcs can achieve that, or in the case of the half-orc, even surpass it. All races can be unlimited level thieves except half-orcs, who are limited to 8th level. However, half-orcs can be unlimited level of assassins. Now, unlimited with an asterisk because assassins have a level cap. Like the class just stops at a certain point. It doesn't keep advancing. Same with druids and same with monks. They all have a level limit built into that class. The other classes do not. Okay, so you see these racial level limits here. So this is all designed now. These little asterisks and parentheses, that's all for, not parentheses, but asterisks and little, so the little numbers here will tell us that dwarven fighters with less than 17 strength are limited to 7th level. Those with 17 strength are limited to 8th level, and etc. So all the way through. So what you're seeing here is the highest, assuming you have an 18 in the stat. And if you don't, it's going to be less than that. And that's all going to be dealt with right there. Okay, so those are your racial level class limitations. First off, which class you can be, and then what level you can go to. Now, as you see, it's very consistent with what we saw in original Dungeons and Dragons. Now, one of the things, again, that you're not going to see on this table is the Bard. That's because the Bard is detailed here in the appendix. Basically, the Bard is going to be allowed to be human or half-elf only. Okay. And what's going to happen here is that they're going to start out as fighters, then they're going to become thieves, then they're going to become druids. And once they become a druid, then they're a bard. So I've talked all about that again in that video on the bard. But the reason that only humans and half-elves can be bards is because only humans and half-elves can be druids. Halflings can be druids, but only as NPCs up to level 6, and that's not high enough level for them to do what they need to do to become bards, okay? So that's why the bard's not in here. But again, going back to this idea that it's making sure, the way that this is presented, that humans are going to maintain and stay central in a human-centric world. All right, so let's talk about that a little bit more and look at an article that Gary Gygax wrote. So one of the great things about Best of Dragon Volume 2 is it has this whole section on the Sorcerer's Scroll. This was Gary Gygax's column that he wrote in D&D. And so it's including a lot of his more famous ones, which are talking about like the philosophy behind the creation of the game of Dungeons & Dragons. And humans and hybrids. This is the article that I want to address. This is from September 1979, issue number 29 of Dragon Magazine. And again, it's written before that, of course. I don't know how far before. And it says, of late, I've seen several different treatments of half-ogres and the suggestion that this type of creature is a viable, worthwhile racial type for player characters and thus gains some small popularity. And so he says, this subject also touches upon another closely related matter, the whole gamut of crossbreeds which could possibly be included in a D&D game. But this is the key part. The character races in the AD&D system were selected with care. They give variety of approach, but any player selecting a non-human, and then in parentheses, part or demi-human character, does not have any real advantage. True, some of these racial types give short-term advantages to the players who choose them, but in the long run, these same characters are at an equal disadvantage when compared to human characters with the same number of experience points. This was, in fact, designed into the game. The variety of approach makes role selection more interesting. Players must weigh advantages and disadvantages carefully before opting for character race, human or otherwise. It is in vogue in some campaigns to remove restrictions on demi-humans or at least relax them somewhat. While this might make the DM popular for a time with those participants with dwarven fighters of high level or elven wizards of vast power, it will eventually consign the campaign as a whole to one in which the only races will be non-human. Dwarves, elves, et al. Will have all the advantages and no real disadvantages, so the majority of players will select these races and humankind will disappear from the realm of player character types. This bears upon various hybrid racial types as well. And then he goes into this whole article on this whole section on, hybrid races and which ones can breed with each other and why he didn't include more than just the half-elf, although he did include the half-orc as well. I guess he forgot he'd included that. That was that article. But again, it's this intended design philosophy from Gary. So, and he's doing it to both provide a game balance reason and to protect the humans in the game because he thinks that they should be the most prevalent. So again, that might not be your philosophy of how you want to run your campaign world, and that's fine. And again, we'll talk about that at the end of the video, but that's what Gary was thinking. Now, what's going to happen is we're going to get into the 80s now, and things are going to start kind of changing up a little bit. So this is Dragon Magazine number 95. I love this cover. Okay, this is by Dean Morrissey. Okay, October of 1984, this cover. And So you see it says new demi-human rules. So let's look at that, see what we're talking about here. So this came out in March of 1985. It's on page 8, demi-humans get a lift. Okay, so let's go look at what we're looking at here. It says the last word on level limits and abilities by Gary Gygax. You see he's copyrighted it now. He's being very particular about what belongs to him. After long contemplation of the plight of dead-ended demi-human characters and considerable badgering from players was same, it seemed a good plan to work up some new maximum levels for those demi-humans with supernormal characteristics, and in a couple of cases, just reward those with high stats across the board. Demi-humans were limited in the first place. Sorry for moving that around, in the original rules, because I conceived of a basically human-dominated world. Considering their other abilities, if most demi-humans were put on par with humans in terms of levels they could attain, then there isn't much question who would be saying sir to whom. With that in mind, let's move along to the matter at hand. So he says single-class demi-humans. If any player character demi-human operates within a single profession or class, then that character can exceed all stated experience level maximums by 2. For example, a player character dwarf with less than 17 strength who is a fighter and only a fighter can attain 9th level in that profession instead of being forced to stop at 7th level. A half-elf who was a cleric and only a cleric can now rise as high as 7th level in that profession. Double or triple class demi-humans must still abide by the level limits given in the player's handbook, such as the price of diversity. And it says, by no stretch of the rules can single class characters attain half again or twice again the number of levels shown in the rules. Although some DMs allow this, such characters are not standard and can't be allowed in general campaign play. All right, so it talks all about this thing, and so it gives you falling toe. Basically, Gary's going to start bowing to pressure from people saying like that these rules for demi-humans are unfair and that they need to be expanded. And so he's going to give you new level limits that you're going to see here. And he's also, you see, going to divide up these races into sub-races. Dwarves, he's now going to show as hill, and then Dwergar or mountain. And then halflings, he's going to show as hare, feet, stout, and tall fellows. Now, those existed, hare, feet, stouts, and tall fellows existed in the player's handbook for first edition, but they weren't distinguished on all of the tables. But here he's going to distinguish them because tall fellow fighters can advance farther than either hare, feet, or stout. Hare, feet advance the least, and stouts are in the middle. Okay, and for elves, he's going to have separate table just for drow, and then he's going to break that up between male and female drow. Because it's a matriarchal society, so he's going to decide that we're going to need to see the differences there. And then for he's got Gruggish elves, other types of elves, gray, high, valley, wood elves, and he's got gnomes, and it says any because there's going to be different gnomes here soon enough. And then he's got half elves and half orcs. Okay, so that is the details on race level limitations in Dragon Magazine number 95. Now, the very next month, Dragon Magazine number 96, and sadly this cover has come off, and it just they were stapled. It sucks. Okay, but it says more class for demi-humans. You see that right here on this cover. Okay, so what are we looking at with that? Okay, so this is from April of 1985. It says new jobs for demi-humans, dwarven clerics, elven rangers, and that's not all. So you think that my extension of level limits for demi-humans with exceptional statistics was stingy, do you? Well, gentle readers, despite all assumptions to the contrary, I do not dislike characters of non-human stock. In a world where humans are the principal population, the rule of most states is by mankind. I believe that the level limits set in the AD&D game system, as expanded through articles published within these hallowed pages, and is eventually redone in the new Player's Handbook editions, which that's going to be Unearthed Arcana, are correct and necessary. Humans would be an inferior species if the limits on demi-humankind were removed. However, let's look at some new logical concepts for demi-humans which are not destructive to the underlying game concepts. Demi-human clerics. With expansion of the deities in the world of Greyhawk fantasy setting, and by Roger Moore's articles herein so as to provide for the races of demi-humankind, there is no logical reason to exclude their clerics from play. And then it says, it tells you which articles to read. That's the editor's note. The level limits for non-exceptional clerics are one less than the numbers shown on the table below. That is 7th for dwarves, 6th for elves, etc. So he's going to tell you that elves, dwarves, gnomes, half-elves, and halflings can now be clerics, as long as they have a minimum wisdom of 15, or in a halfling case, minimum wisdom of 16. Note that these new limits apply to player characters and NPCs alike. That is, the prohibition against PC clerics of Dwarven, Elven, or Gnome stock is abolished, and Halflings are likewise now able to be either PC or NPC clerics, although on a limited basis. Demi-human druids, elves, half-elves, and halflings being more nature-oriented than the other demi-human races deserve admission to the druid subclass. Elves are now unlimited in their ability to rise in levels within the druidical ranks, just as half-elves have always been. Furthermore, halflings can become PC or NPC druids of 5th level or greater, limited to 5th if either wisdom or charisma is below 15, but able to advance as high as 13th level if the ability scores are exceptional, and then he gives you a table. Demi-human rangers. Elves are no longer prohibited from entering the ranger subclass, in keeping with the same reasoning that now opens the druid subclass to that race. For consistency, half-elven rangers are also given more potential. Level limits for half-elven or for elven and half-elven rangers are now fallen below, and then he gives you a table. So half-elves can now go as high as let's see. Looks like level 17 as a ranger. If their strength is 20, their intelligence is 18, and their wisdom is 18. So again, ability score inflation. All right. And it says, the ability, it talks about the ability scores. Both elven and half-elven characters can be druid rangers. So that was a big thing at the time. It created a lot of controversy to say that they could be druid rangers, because druids in first edition Advanced D&D had to be true neutral. They couldn't be neutral good or anything like that. They had to be true neutral, but rangers had to be good. They could be lawful good, neutral good, or chaotic good. Now, the implication, if you figure it out, is that, a druid ranger is probably neutral good, but it didn't say that. And a lot of people were like, wait a second. People were very, very confused. So this is a new expansion, again, to these class and race limitations that we'd seen before. Now, all of that is then going to be put in this book, Unearthed Arcana. It comes out late in 1985, so not that long after those articles were published. But all those tables that you saw are basically going to be repeated here and expand this, and now this becomes official, because this is an official AD&D hardback book. The articles in Dragon Magazine, at a certain point, the editors just say, if Gary writes it, that is considered official, and you could use those. But now more people are going to see it in this book here. So we're going to see all these different options here of what races can be what. Now, very interestingly, elves have limitations for, like, say, rangers, as an example, where certain types of elves cannot become rangers. You have to be a specific kind of elf. And then half-elves have to be descended from specific elven stock. So I think it's like gray high and dark elf, and then they can become cavaliers. And also half-elves in here are now open up to becoming paladins, which was something that they couldn't do before. So that's a big deal that is in this book. And I talked about that again in my video on the paladin that was just published. So that's the expansion of the rules here. So this is really sort of like an inflection point. There's this tension between world simulation, but also keeping players and, let's be fair, customers happy. They want to buy things that have expanded abilities and options for demi-human characters. And so Gary is going to placate them by increasing those level limits and class race restrictions. That is here in Unearthed Arcana and those articles from 1985. If you'd like to support Daddy Rolled the One, I've already talked about my Patreon, but there are 3 other ways that you can also help support. You can become a super fan right here on YouTube. You don't even have to leave the channel that you're watching right now. Just hit that little heart icon with the $sign in it, and you'll get your name listed here with all these other fine folks who have contributed to my videos as a thank you to me for all the time and effort. It does take a lot of time. The deeper we go and the more niche these subjects get, it takes longer and longer to research, and then it takes longer to record and edit because I have to keep starting over and making sure that I'm saying things correctly. It's not stuff that I know off the top of my head like some of my earlier videos are. And so these people are thanking me for that time and effort, a lot of them on every single video, and I really, really appreciate it. You can also buy some merchandise from my shop. You can get t-shirt, hoodies, mugs, and tote bags from my spread shop. And you can get paper goods like stickers, posters, and notebooks from my Redbubble shop, all with exclusive designs, specifically designed for tabletop role-playing game fans. And you'll only find these designs on my channel. I've also got a couple other geek adjacent designs, some Star Wars inspired things that I think are really fun. So take a look at those now. And especially if you want to buy something for the holidays, you're going to want to jump on that to make sure it gets shipped in time. I also want to tell folks who ordered from my old shop when I was at Teespring, the reason I switched from that is because I heard from a lot of you that you'd ordered things that never showed up. And I know a lot of you had to cancel your orders, and I apologize. I have nothing to do with the printing on that. I didn't know what a mess that system was. And just so you know, you're not the only one that was affected. I haven't been paid by them. They owe me money from more than 6 months ago for designs that were sold that they've never paid me for. So I do want to apologize to folks that did buy things from there and either never got it or you had to cancel. And I'm so sorry about that. But that's why I switched, and the new company is working great. So you can feel a little bit more comfortable ordering from Spreadshop and Redbubble. And then lastly, you can order my supplement here, Alchemy Explosives and Inventions, created for old school role-playing games, like class and level games, especially designed for old school essentials. So this is a book about playing skilled type expert characters. Okay, so like I have a table in here where I take these 7 basic BX or old school essential classes and tweak them to create things like artillerists, pathfinders, sappers, arcane artisans, sages, courtiers, merchants, saboteurs, give them a little bit of a ability in one way, hindrance in another for some balance. And then I have dozens and dozens of random tables to show how to bring those concepts to life. And then I've also got 3 new character classes. There's alchemists, demolitionists, and inventors with new pages of equipment for all of 3 of those classes. I've got a 3-story guild hall with a map, NPCs, secrets, hooks, adventure hooks, and rumors, all that kind of stuff. And then advice for running these types of characters in a campaign. You can also use them as NPCs, as a dungeon master or a referee, whatever you want to call that. And you can get it as a softcover POD, print on demand, or as a PDF in either this fancy parchment background, or you can get plain white background if that's easier to read. So check that out. The link's at DriveThruRPG below. And thank you so much for your support. Okay, and now the last edition that we're really going to look at in depth is going to be Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition. And we're going to see a drift toward flexibility. So again, this is 1989 when this comes out. This is after Gary Gygax has essentially been forced out of the company. So he was removed of his positions, but he was allowed to stay on the board. But at this point, he has decided to sell his shares and to remove himself completely from the company. And it started because he was removed from his positions by the board of directors. So this is not written by Gary Gygax, this version of 2nd edition. It's written by mostly Dave Zeb Cook, although there's other people involved. And it is built upon the bones of 1st edition, but the tone is going to be very different. So it's really more of a shift in tone and also in presentation than it is like mechanical changes. There are mechanical changes, and I've done a whole video on the changes between 2nd and 1st edition. But what I want to talk about here is that there's going to be some softening of these restrictions. And sometimes the restrictions are labeled as being optional. So what's really interesting in here, you still have class and race and class restrictions behind what race can be what class. Okay, and so it's going to deal with that a little bit here in this section up front. And it's all the traditional ones that you're used to. Okay, so it's going to tell us that dwarves can be fighters and thieves. There are no assassins in this particular version of the game. Okay, so they've removed assassins. And it says you can also be a cleric. So you can be a fighter cleric or a fighter thief, or you can just, be a single class cleric, fighter, or thief. Elves have a little bit more options here. So it's going to tell us that elves can operate as player character elf can be a cleric, fighter, mage, thief, or ranger. So again, kind of what we saw in the Unearthed Arcana, or those articles in Dragon Magazine that started expanding the options. Gnomes are going to talk about how they can be a fighter, thief, cleric, or illusionist. And then it says they can have 2 classes, but not 3. So you can mix and match any of those 2, but you can't operate as 3 classes. Half-elves have, again, as always they have many more options that half-elves can operate as. So it says of all the demi-human races, half-elves have the greatest range of choices. Druids, rangers, clerics, fighters, mages, specialist wizards, thieves, and bards. Okay, so Bard in this version of the game is going to stop being that appendix version. Bard is going to change to be, just a regular class, just like any other class. It's not like those weird prestige classes. Okay, so that's half elves, and then halflings it's going to say that basically halflings can operate as clerics, fighters, thieves, or multi-class fighter thieves. And then humans, it's going to say they have only one special ability. They can be any character class and rise to any level of class. Okay, so that's kind of a big deal for humans in here. All right. So now one of the things that's interesting that's going to happen is it's going to explain all of the different, classes and all this kind of thing. But as far as like the class and race option, this second edition is the first time that we're going to see in a rule book some rationale and explanation for these class restrictions, class race restrictions, and level limits. It says class restrictions and level limits. The human race has one special ability in the AD&D game. Humans can choose to be of any class, warrior, wizard, priest, or rogue, and can rise to great level in any class. Just a quick note here. I hear a lot of people complain. It's like, a lot of people on YouTube do this. Like second edition, this is when they watered everything down, and you no longer had thieves. They changed it to rogue. They didn't change it to rogue. There are still thieves in this book. Rogue is the overall classification that includes thieves and bards. It's just like it says, like they didn't change fighter to warrior. There are still fighters. Warrior is the overall class group that includes fighters, rangers, and paladins. Just like priest, they didn't change cleric to priest. You still have clerics. The priest group includes clerics and specialty priests, which includes druids. Okay, so just a little nitpick of mine when I hear people harp on that, because people get it wrong all the time. Okay, so it's, and can rise to great level in any class. The other races have fewer choices of character classes and usually are limited in the level they can attain. These restrictions reflect the natural tendencies of the races. Dwarves like war and fighting and dislike magic, etc. These limits are high enough so that a demi-human can achieve power and importance in at least one class. A halfling, for example, can become the best thief in the land, but he cannot become a great fighter. The limits also exist for play balance. The ability of humans to assume any role and reach any level is their only advantage. The demi-human races have other powers that make them entertaining to play, particularly the ability to be multi-classed. These powers balance the enjoyment of play against the ability to rise in level. Ask your DM for the level limits imposed on non-human characters. Now that's interesting. They're not going to put the level limits in the player's handbook. It says ask your DM. So I find that really, really interesting. Now, the other thing it talks about in here is that, in general, dwarves like war and fighting and dislike magic. But then it says over here, it says that all 6 of the standard races are described in detail in this chapter. In many cases, broad statements are made concerning the race in general. Players are not bound by these generalities. For example, the statement that dwarves tend to be dour and taciturn does not mean that your character cannot be a jolly dwarf. It means that the garden variety dwarf is dour and taciturn. If player characters were just like everyone else, they wouldn't be adventurers. Make your character unique and he will be more fun to play. So that's right here in the rule book as well. So, and again, I think a lot of people get caught up on that and forget that like you can play against type and that's something that you can do. However, if you always play against type and every dwarf is playing against type, then it gets confusing because then you don't have a standard dwarf anymore. You've got, maybe you have an all dwarf adventuring group. And if all of them are not playing that typical, grumpy, dour, and taciturn, as it says, dwarves, then you don't have a baseline to judge, like, are these dwarves like an average everyday dwarf, or are they different, right? So use it sparingly, but I think playing against type can be quite a fun way to approach this. Okay, so I think it's interesting, however, that the rules for level limits for the demi-humans are going to be put in the Dungeon Master's Guide, because when we get to the Dungeon Master's Guide, it's going to give us a little bit of more flexibility on how we want to deal with that. I'll just put it that way. So we're seeing that, well, first off, it's going to increase the level caps significantly versus even what we saw in Unearthed Arcana. So we'll get there in a second. And it's moving sort of like from simulation more to like accessibility. Okay. And that's a theme that we're going to see continuing when we get into the Wizards of the Coast area. All right. So I just think it's interesting. It's the first time that in the rule book, they're pointing out why these level limits and class and race restrictions exist. Okay. So now one of the things that's going to point out in the Dungeon Master's Guide, it says, first off, that the DM can, if he chooses, make any class available to any race. This will certainly make your players happy, but before throwing the doors open, considering the consequences. If the only special advantage humans have is given to all of the races, then who will want to play a human? Humans would be the weakest race in your world. Why play a 20th level human paladin when you could play a 20th level elven paladin and have all the abilities of paladins and elves? And then later it goes on to say that building a believable fantasy world is a daunting task. Creating a believable alien fantasy world, which is what a world dominated by non-humans would be, is a huge challenge, even for the best writers of fantasy. What would non-human families be like? What would the popular entertainment be? What would non-humans value? What would they eat? What would their governments be like? A society governed by nature-loving elves would be a very different place than a human-dominated world. And it says it's possible that certain character classes might not even exist. Paladinhood, for example, could be a uniquely human perspective. Would elves or dwarves hold the same values of law, order, God, and community in which a paladin aspires? If you only change the image, so it says basically have elven paladins behave exactly like human paladins, then what you've got is the, and then quotes, human in funny suits syndrome. So I talked about this on my races class video, but these races are intended to be archetypes. And if they're no different than humans, other than having mechanical special abilities, that's the Star Trek, trap that you fall into of like every race being basically just being human with different head ridges. And I talked all about that in that video. That's why Vulcans have a very specific philosophy, and all Vulcans tend to be, non-emotional, and Vulcans have emotion, they just don't show them, right? So, but none of them show their emotions, and so when they do, it stands out. Well, that's one thing. That's that playing against type. But the other thing is that by having them not show emotions, it's making them different from the average human. Okay. And so if people say like, well, it's stereotypical or it's cliche, it is for a reason, because it's easier to role play. For one thing, it's easier to grasp, and it's easier to create them and set them apart from a standard human. As humans, we have to view everything through a human lens. And so we have to then create situations where these different races, non-human races, can act differently than humans. And so we ascribe traits to them, which might seem arbitrary. And it might seem like, well, why can a Vulcan choose to show emotions if they wanted to? They could, but that's not typical for that culture. Okay. So those are some of the things I talk about in that other video. All right. So it basically just says, even within the human race, there are vast cultural differences. Think how much greater those differences would be if blood were entirely different, like you're in a completely different species. Okay, so then it goes on to talk about how you can allow exceptions on a case-by-case basis, but you should only do it like if a player makes a very good case and has a plausible rationale, and then let them try it. And then if it works, maybe then you open it up to your other players. And then it suggests an optional rule of just slower character advancement. So it says if you don't want to limit the class and race options, or you don't want to have level limits, then you should just have slower advancement. Well, that's what the races class does in that BX line that I talked about, or that basic line of D&D. So elves in that game, okay, are combination fighter magic users, but it takes them double the amount of experience points as a human fighter to advance to second level. So elves need 4,000 experience points. So in the game I run for my daughter and her friends, we're playing that version of the game. And there are 2 elves, 1 thief, and 1 cleric. And the thief right now is 4th level. The cleric is 3rd level, almost 4th. And the thief is actually almost 5th, I think. And then the 2 elves are still 2nd level. Okay, so they have not achieved enough experience points to get to 3rd level, because they have abilities that the other 2 characters don't. And so it takes them longer to advance. So I think that was a very elegant solution to the situation, as opposed to the level limits and things like that. Now, BX also has level limits, but it was one of the balancing factors for those classes, Elf, Dwarf, and Halfling, having abilities that humans don't, starting at 1st level. Okay, and then it's going to give you the chart of the level limits here, and you can see it's much, much higher than it was in even Unearthed Arcana. And it's also going to kind of circumvent this idea of the demi-humans achieving name level. So we talked about that a little bit in Unearthed Arcana, but it's going to become even more so here in 2nd edition, where the level limits are much, much higher. Part of that reasoning is because the idea of achieving name level in here and managing a domain and stuff, it's much less of a priority in 2nd edition than it was in 1st edition. So that's 2nd edition D&D. Now, the other thing that's going to happen is, of course, we have the Player's Handbook rules, supplements, and options. So just a few, like you have this complete book of Dwarves. And one of the things that this does is it talks about, again, the character kits, I think, are a great way of sort of figuring out some role-playing hooks. And so they have warrior kits like Animal Master, Axe for Hire, Clans Dwarf, Hearthguard, etc. Priest kits, Craft Priest, Pariah, Patrician, Ritual Priest. And then they have multi-class kits, which is a new thing that first debuts here in this Dwarf Handbook. So they have kits for warrior priests or fighter clerics, Champion and Temple Guard, and Vindicator. Then you've got your thief kits, and then you have warrior thief kits. Ghetto Fighter, Trader, Vermin Slayer, Wayfinder. So you have kits that are only available to dwarves. These kits here aren't available to any other class or any other race. They're only available to dwarves. Same thing with elves. Same kind of idea here. Now, I'm not justifying whether these classes or kits were balanced, because the elf ones definitely are not as balanced as some of the other ones. But the idea, the inspiration, and the flavor. You've got Priest Kit, Herbalist, Warrior Kits, Archer, Wilderness Runner, Windrider, but you also have Mage Thief kits like Elven Minstrel or Spell Filcher. This is where the Blade Singer debuts, the Fighter Mage kit, very, very powerful. And the War Wizard, you've got the Fighter Thief kit of the Huntsman, and then Fighter Mage Thief kits, Collectors and Infiltrators. So again, these are kits that are only open to elves, and it's helping to define their culture based on how they operate in these classes. And that's another way that you can kind of help distinguish these classes from each other, by giving them little tweaks and making them different from other fighters or other clerics, or however you want to do it. Now, one of the things that, for example, the Bard's book does, it talks about making demi-human bards. So let's go to page 53 and look at that. And we're going to see this section where it says, okay, as per the player's handbook, only humans and half-elves can become bards. Even this book doesn't allow dwarves, elves, gnomes, and halflings to become bards in the true sense of the word. However, each of these races has a strong tradition in the performing arts. Dwarven chanters are legendary, as are great elven minstrels, gnome professors, and halfling whistlers. And so it basically says, if you want to play one of those races as a bard, you can, but you very specifically have to pick a kit, and you can't play a true bard. So if you don't pick a kit, then you can't be a bard. And so they're going to call them demi-bards. And so dwarves can be chanters, heralds, and skalds. Elves can be gypsies, heralds, lore masters, maester singers, and minstrels. And then gnomes can be charlatans, heralds, professors, jesters, jongleurs, and riddle masters. Anything you see in italics is a brand new kit that's going to be debut here. So only gnomes can become professors, only elves can be minstrels, and only dwarves can be chanters. And then halflings can be heralds, jesters, jongleurs, riddle masters, and whistlers. And the halfling whistler is a kit that is unique to halflings. Okay, so and same thing with the Ranger's Handbook. I'm not going to go through that one. I pulled it out for a second, but they describe creating demi-human rangers in there, because only elves, half-elves, and humans could be rangers. And so it talks about, well, you could create a demi-human ranger by picking a very specific kit that's designed just for that race. So there's a specific ranger type kit for dwarves, halflings, and gnomes that you could play in that version of the game. And so that is kind of getting us to this idea of, like, how can we adapt this concept today and use it to kind of keep these sort of limitations while keeping your players happy. But before we get there, I just want to talk about how in early D&D, it wasn't designed, again, for immediate fairness. I know I've kind of harped on that a lot, but I want to make sure that point gets through. It was designed to feel believable over years of play. System and setting were one. They were combined, and they were integral to each other. But when you start to remove those limits, when they vanished and we gained flexibility, I think we lost a little bit of distinction. And, that's just my opinion. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but things start to get a little bit samey. They start to, again, you're losing that. They're becoming a little bit more generic, I would say. So the world becomes less about culture, and it becomes more about capability. And this is where you start to get to things like in 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition, where any race can be any class, and there's no level limitations, and there's no downside to playing halfling monk or a half orc wizard or a dwarf paladin. There's no limitations there, and there's no downside. What you start doing is looking at, well, if I combine these abilities from this race with these abilities from this class, I'm going to be extra good at doing this thing. That's where you get into this idea of a build for a character, which isn't something that you necessarily did as much in earlier editions, because you had limitations and you had to, again, figure out how to work within those limitations to be creative. Okay, so I'm not saying you can't be creative by playing those other options. I loved when they opened that up when 3rd edition came about. But again, reflecting back now, I do kind of like the idea of having some limitations. I just don't always think they have to be the exact same limitations that we've seen before, okay, in the previous editions. Okay, so for me, I think, how do we use this philosophy? Let's call it a philosophy, not a mechanic. And how do we apply it to games of today? I think it's about embracing the difference. Okay. And it's not about being the same. Okay. So it's, maybe restricting by culture instead of by biology. So as an example, making specific race only class options, a specific dwarf only version of a paladin, maybe that only the dwarf can take, and it has different abilities from a regular paladin. So there's drawbacks, there's pros and cons, but you could play that, but only a dwarf could be that specific thing. Or maybe you restrict your setting by saying, you know what, only elves are attuned to nature. They're the only race that can be druids. Okay, so you're not even changing the class. You're just eliminating other. So not even humans can be druids. Only elves can be druids, right? So you're kind of helping to define your world and your culture. Or maybe only gnomes can be illusionists. That's not a skill that humans can learn. Okay, or maybe you do something like, yeah, elves can be magic users, as can humans, but elves have a completely different spell list. And it would take time, but you would create a unique spell list just for elves, and humans can't learn those spells and vice versa. And then in the unique case of the half-elf, they have to pick and choose. Or maybe they have the ability to pick from both lists. And that's one of their special benefits, is that they can pick from either list. But elves have a separate list and humans have a separate list. So I think that's a fun way to look at, again, adding some uniqueness to your characters and kind of using these level limitations. So I did a short, and I know a lot of you don't watch my shorts, but one of the things I mentioned in that short was if you're playing a modern game, so you have sorcerers, right, which are the innate magical casting characters. So they don't prepare their spells. They just innately know how to cast them. I was saying, what if halflings are the only race in your world that can be sorcerers? Nobody else. Then what does that say about halflings and their relationship to magic? What does it say about the nature of magic in your world and your campaign setting if gnomes are the only people that can become sorcerers and have this innate ability of magic? I think that's a fascinating way to define that culture and just be very unique and different. Okay. And I think it's, reimagining the limits as social or mystical ceilings, not as like these hard mechanical blocks. Okay. And you can apply this to any system. You can do it in 5e, create your own classes or subclasses that are unique to certain races to help them be distinct, so that not every race is taking the same subclass. An elf, fighter with, I don't know what the subclasses are in 5e because I don't play 5e off the top of my head, but if an elf fighter with a subclass A, and you have a human fighter with subclass A, and if they're played the exact same way and there's no difference, then why are you playing an elf? And you might be playing for role-playing reasons. That's great. That's totally fine. But a way to help you define that would be, well, what if the elf's abilities in that class are different than the human who took that same subclass, or have a unique elf subclass like I talked about? You can do it very easily in OSR-style games, and you can do it in your own homebrew stuff, classes that echo these old archetypes. You can limit in your games, which race is which class. Or again, I like the idea of creating new, unique classes for different races. Okay, so I think that race limits are really not about they're not about telling players no. They're about making the world say something, making that world be unique. Okay, but that's just what I think. I would love to hear what you think. So, these restrictions, these TSR era restrictions were not arbitrary. They were intentional. They were meaningful design tools. And I would love to hear, do you think modern D&D lost something by removing racial restrictions, or were those the best relics, or were those relics best left behind? Do you think that it's better that we don't have these race and class restrictions and level limits, and non-humans can be any race and any class and go to any level? And both are valid. Okay. So I'm not arguing that one's better than the other. I obviously have a preference, but I would love to hear what you think. So leave that in the comments below and let me know. And then while you're down there, you'll find places to join me on social media. You'll find links to my blog. You'll find all the links where you can support the channels I mentioned before, and like my shop and all that kind of stuff. And that's going to wrap up this particular video. So thank you very, very much for watching. Stay safe. Happy gaming, and I'll talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. I'm going to go with the album first. This is actually one that was in my dad's collection after he passed away. I grabbed it. So it's interesting. John Coltrane, I wouldn't have thought would be something that my dad was really into, but my dad heard me listening to Coltrane a lot. And so I think just kind of picked up a like. of Coltrane. So I had this album on CD, but I didn't own it on vinyl, which is why I grabbed my dad's after he passed. But this is 1963's John Coltrane and Johnny Hartman. So John Coltrane, of course, very famous saxophone player. Now, Johnny Hartman, you might not be familiar with. He was a singer, a baritone singer, mostly standards and things like that. But what's going to happen? So the mix of them together was thought to kind of be, I'm going to scoop my drink and stuff over here so I can fit more of this onto the screen here. But at the time, people kind of were like, this doesn't really seem to make sense. So you've seen me feature another album where I talked about John Coltrane and Duke Ellington. And that was another match where people were like, this doesn't make sense at all. And this one was kind of in that same vein. But actually, Coltrane was the one who approached Hartman. And Hartman, the singer, was a little reticent at first. But then Coltrane's producer and got John Hartman to go to Birdland and listen to Coltrane play. And he did. And he's like, yeah, I think this is going to work. And so they sat down with McCoy Tyner, the pianist who played for Coltrane. You see him listed here. And they worked out the set list. And then as they were driving home, they ended up hearing a version of the song Lush Life by Nat King Cole on the radio. And they're like, well, that has to be on the album. And so that made it on here. It's one of the more famous tracks. It's probably my favorite track on here. Autumn Serenade is one I play a lot during the autumn time, which is why I pulled this album out, because it's now, today is November 13th. And so we're in the thick of autumn, and I love this song, Autumn Serenade. Now, John Hartman's voice, baritone, very deep. It can be a little off-putting to a lot of people if you're not used to that style of singing, but that juxtaposed with John Coltrane's saxophone playing is just amazing. So these songs were said to be recorded all in a single take, with the exception of, I want to say it's Lush Life, actually. I can't remember exactly. One of them was recorded. It might be You Are Too Beautiful. I forget which one, but in one of those recordings, unfortunately, Elvin Jones on drums here dropped one of his drumsticks. And so they had to re-record the song. But otherwise, the other songs on here are all first takes. And then when they go back into the studio with Rudy Van Gelder, famous jazz mastering person, unfortunately passed, as has Johnny Hartman, and of course, John Coltrane's passed. But John Coltrane is actually going to lay some more saxophone down on top of the original tracks. So they didn't re-record them. They're not alternate takes. It's like he just added additional playing on top of the tracks that already existed. So hopefully one day we'll get to hear the originals released. I read that they were kind of, it's in limbo as far as who owns the rights to that. So who knows if we'll get to see them, but I definitely recommend checking this out. This is going to be the only album that Coltrane's going to record as a band leader with a vocalist. So that's how important he thought that this was. It's also thought to be, for most people, Johnny Hartman's best album that he played on, or that he sang on. It's in the Grammy Hall of Fame, like all these kinds of stuff. So 1963, John Coltrane and Johnny Hartman. Now, what I was drinking when I made this is basically going to be like, we can call it an autumn old-fashioned. I don't know exactly what term you want to use. It's essentially just an old-fashioned cocktail. I use rye whiskey, Old Overholt. It's my favorite. It's my bartender's favorite. And then I use this. So somebody gave this to me. It's called a pumpkin spice authentic cocktail elixir. Elixir is a little strong. Let's just call it a cocktail syrup. It's essentially a syrup is what it is. Okay. And it's got pumpkin, filtered water, cane sugar, ginger, cinnamon, nutmeg, and allspice. All of those fall flavors that you like in a syrup. And then for the bitters, I added some of these whiskey barrel aged cocktail flavoring bitters. And then my orange was really janky. It wasn't in great shape. So rather than show a janky orange peel, I used some of this orange spray that I made. So I did the cheap and easy way, which is that I zested an orange and I soaked it in high proof vodka and then a little bit of water, and I just let it infuse. And then I strained out the peel and I poured it into my little atomizer here. And then, you give it a spray on top of your drink, which I already did. And it kind of replicates the idea of, like, I didn't have a nice orange peel to express the oils. Now there's a fancier way to make an orange oil, an actual orange oil, which is that you're going to blend the orange peels with high proof alcohol, like vodka, neutral grain, and water. You're going to blend it, and then you're going to let it sit, and the oil is going to kind of like solidify. And then you're going to refrigerate it, and you're going to pour the oil off, away, and then you're going to add it back a little bit extra high proof alcohol to kind of thin it out, and then you place it in here. That's more of like a stronger orange oil. It just takes longer, and I didn't do that. But anyway, That's why I don't have an orange peel. I'm using one of my dad's old cocktail glasses because I'm listening to his album that he had. So I thought I would use one of these. These are the ones I grew up seeing him and my mom drink out of. Very rarely, by the way, but when they did have a beverage, it was usually out of a glass like this. It's green and gold. It's hard to see. But cheers, and thanks for sticking through the bonus content. I hope you enjoyed the video. And that little sip. It's really nice. I'm also very careful with my sugar. You guys know I don't like sugar cocktails. Hopefully you know that by now. But once again, thanks for watching the video. Please take a few seconds if you can to watch some of these other videos listed here. The algorithm really, really likes that if you click through on these. And cheers, and I will talk to you next time.